Thank you very much. This is a big subject, and we don't have very much time, so let's get right to it. We're joined by Lisa Anderson, Professor Emerita of the International Relations, Dean Emerita of SIPA, also President of the American University in Cairo from 2011 through 2016 during the Arab Spring protests. Mauricio Cárdenas, Professor of Professional Practice and Global Leadership in the Faculty of International and Public Affairs, Director of the MPA in Global Leadership, formerly, among other things, Finance Minister of Colombia. Tom Christensen, Professor at SIPA, Director of Colombia's China and the World Program. He served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs with responsibility for relations with China, Taiwan, and Mongolia. And Victoria Nuland, the Shelby Cullom Davis Professor in the Practice of International Diplomacy and the Director of the International Fellows Program at SIPA. A career ambassador, she previously served as Acting Deputy Secretary of State and as Undersecretary for Political Affairs. So we have a very short period of time to at least try to hit some of the challenges in the geopolitical arena. And so, Toria, let me start with you. Because I think it's interesting to ask what it's like now to teach and try to make sense of the world with your students. How do you draw out the contradictions of what we see going on with the new administration and some of the real norm breaking that is taking place?
Well, first of all, let me just say how thrilled I am to be at SIPA and to be running the International Fellows Program with the best students at SIPA, some of whom are here today. You know, I think before the new administration came into office, we were already in the classroom understanding what an intense period this is, with a hot war in Ukraine, with a hot war and now a ceasefire in Gaza, with China competing aggressively and coercing others. But now the question of who the United States is going to be in that world is front and center in the classroom, because we have, in our first semester, taught that 80-year U.S. personality of, yes, strong global leadership, sometimes aggressive global leadership, but also great global generosity and alliance building. And now we have a different approach. And we need, as we always do in the classroom, to be open to new ideas, to think about whether that 80 years of doing things one way might not need some adapting. But at the same time, we also have folks in the classroom whose jobs are on the line. You know, I have students who've been invited to the State Department in AID who don't know whether they will be working. We have military officers who are going to be asked to do different things. We have folks from the business school who grew up thinking tariffs were, as the first panel discussed, not a great idea, and now they're going to be central to what we do economically. So it's a big adjustment, but it's important that we continue to explore these things together, and we do it with our international students as well as our Americans.
So, Lisa, let's shift to the Middle East for a moment. Obviously, we're seeing enormous change, upheaval in the region, and in addition to the realignments with Assad gone in Syria, Hezbollah weakened considerably, Hamas certainly weakened but not out, Iran on the back foot, ceasefire and hostage deal, and then a proposal to turn Gaza into a Dubai-like Riviera and expel its 2 million Palestinian inhabitants. It's very difficult to really understand and make sense of where we are. And I think that, from your long experience, give us a quick summary overview what is the future of Gaza? What is the future of any potential deal of normalization between Israel and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia? What does it mean if the president follows through on what he said today, which was to threaten to take away aid from Egypt and Jordan in order to press them to take 2 million residents of Gaza?
Okay, well, first of all, let me thank you, Secretary Clinton, and thank Karen and everyone for convening us all together. I want to say two things on a sort of more perhaps personal level before I can't answer that question, but I can address it. First of all, I want to say to everyone associated with SIPA, I think what you do, what we do, is incredibly important. Public policy is important. International affairs is important. And we're at a moment where that's a particularly difficult case to make, perhaps, but one of the reasons why I think it was appropriate entirely to have this event here is to make that case and to say the kinds of work that SIPA has done for decades and decades is incredibly important. And it has been, on the second note, a very gratifying to see how many people who have been involved at SIPA in various relationships. Karen, you said there were MIAs and MPA graduates. Actually, they're a bunch of certificate graduates. I am one of them, and I am a proud alum. And so there are all various IFP people and so forth and so on. What we do is important, and what we do is going to, as it has historically, make an enormous difference. And so I just want to say I'm proud to be a part of this community. I always have been, and I have more optimism and confidence as a result of that association. I think the Middle East, and Secretary Clinton, you and I are among the relatively few people in this room who probably remember the '67 war. This is one of the most difficult periods in memory. This is a very, very complicated time. It's not clear, in my estimation, that any of the governments in the region and in the world, including our own, really are equipped to try and figure out what this should look like in the long run. We tend, for obvious reasons, to be focused on Gaza. The president is focused on Gaza. In many ways, we have been focused collectively on Gaza for almost a year and a half at this point. There's a new government in Syria. Iran is in a different position than it was before. There's actually a president in Lebanon. There are a lot of things that have changed that we haven't been paying as much attention to as we might. So I think, in some respects, there are opportunities here to think about the region in a different way. I'm not sure that the American government is at the leading edge of that. Clearly, as everyone has said, the proposals on Gaza that President Trump has offered to us are out of the box. I think out of the box need not be a euphemism for unusual and cruel, as they sometimes seem to be. But I do think the moment for new thinking and reconceptualizing what the region is going to look like is upon us, and appropriately so. So in the short run, I do not think the idea that residents of Gaza will be happily resettled in other places is a starter. I don't think that will happen. And I think the American president's threatening of Jordan and Egypt on that score is going to actually mobilize the Saudis against it. So I think we're going to see a challenge to the Abraham Accords as a result of this. That's not obviously what the president intends, but I think that's the short-term likely outcome, and then what happens after that, it's very hard to tell, as it always has been.
Thank you, Lisa. Well, let's talk, Mauricio, about Latin America, because there's a lot of moving parts in that region as well that you know. So we had the back and forth between our president and the president of Colombia over the handling of deportations, and it led to a diplomatic spat that took place over X, formerly known as Twitter. And of course, the outcome led to, you know, a worrisome set of challenges from the government of Colombia to this current administration. We had the talk about the Panama Canal, with the Secretary of State taking his very first trip to Panama, where the threats continued about what should be done with the canal. And we saw Panama back out of the China Belt and Road Initiative, which again led this administration to claim a certain accomplishment there. We've seen El Salvador offer to open its prisons to violent criminal deportees. We've seen the threat to remove temporary protective status to something like 350,000 Venezuelans, along with others, including Haitians, to be sent back. We've seen the opening of Guantanamo to be used as a either prison or way station. So as you look at the region and the kind of shockwaves that are being felt there, what is your perspective on what we can expect going forward?
Well, thank you very much, Secretary Clinton. I'm delighted to be here. I direct SIPA's newest program, which is the MPA in Global Leadership, and I'm so happy to report that we already have a table of alumni that are here, only 2 cohorts, and they have landed in Washington, great jobs. So, I mean, this is a region you know so well. I think the audience will also be very interested in your views, but let me give you my views. President Petro from Colombia was absolutely right about complaining about the humanitarian condition in which the deportees were being sent to Colombia. I mean, handcuffed, with chains, treated like criminals. But he did it in a way that backfired, because the reaction was overwhelming. In less than 12 hours, he had capitulated, essentially because the sanctions, the increase in tariffs, the suspension of visas, all of that, put the whole country during that Sunday in a situation where even his closest allies, his own members of the cabinet, said, we'll have to fix this. So that served President Trump a great opportunity to show that force and send a signal to the rest of the world. So Colombia, at the end of the day, played that role. If you look at what has happened since then, on the surface, you could say American foreign policy has been successful. It went to Panama, Secretary Rubio, the Panamanians agree to change the terms of the contract with the Chinese company that runs the 2 ports on the canal. Leaving the Belt and Road Initiative was also something that was mentioned at that time. El Salvador receiving not just deportees, but also criminals, US citizens that are criminals in US jails. And I think the most important of all that is the decision by President Sheinbaum of Mexico to send 10,000 military to secure the northern border of Mexico. So you'd say, well, you know, we're succeeding. We're getting our neighbors in this region. This is what the US could say, do the right thing. But I have serious reservations about that. And I see 3 major risks coming up. So if you dig deeper, the whole strategy can backfire. First, if you stretch this rubber band too much, you may break it. And if you break it, say, for example, Mexico's trade represents 90% of its GDP. So I'd say the entire Mexican economy is trade. And of that, 90% is trade with the United States. So if you increase tariffs to Mexico, say by 50%, you're going to kill that economy. And if you kill the Mexican economy, there'll be more migrants coming to the United States. What about remittances? Remittances represent, in some countries in Central America, 30, 40, 50% of their GDPs. If you tax remittances, as has been mentioned here as an option in the United States, that is also going to reduce incomes in Central America, send more people northbound, send more people to the US. So the strategy can backfire in the sense that you have more migrants coming to the United States if the initial purpose was to keep people south of the border. Risk number two, you can show force. You can show arrogance, but you cannot humiliate people. If you humiliate people, the damage that you cause lasts more than one American presidency. Take, for example, of 1903, when Colombia lost Panama. Colombia felt humiliated. It took more than 20 years to restore diplomatic relations with the United States because in Colombia it was politically toxic to talk about having a diplomatic relationship with the United States. So don't humiliate, especially your allies, your neighbors. Third risk, and I think this goes to the panel that we had before, and Merit mentioned this very well, which is we live in a world where the US has always promoted the idea of rules in the sense of providing trust, confidence, transparency, security. If you change the rules because you don't like the free trade agreement you signed a few years ago, then you're not credible, and therefore you're not in a better position than other countries that you have always complained that are not rule-based. So that would put less interest on the part of countries to have a negotiation with the US, have a partnership with the United States, which are the elements that I think have been essential and central to the relationship between the US and Latin America. I can tell you this, I think there are more calls being made now from Latin America to China than before. And I think ultimately this means that in the medium to long term, the whole strategy can backfire because you are undermining the essence of an agreement with the United States, which is its stability. So I think if we look at the surface today, we say, oh, American show of force is being very successful. But I think it's just a matter of time. If you take a more long-term perspective, I think you can have a very different conclusion.
Well, you mentioned China, and let me turn now to Tom. This is right up your alley, Tom. You have written about the importance of allies and partners in the strategic competition with China and how important it is to engage China from a position of strength for deterrence, for negotiation purposes, surrounded by allies and partners with whom you are aligned. So how do you see the last 2 weeks, it's hard to believe now, I guess maybe 3 weeks, impacting the thinking in Beijing? And are we in a stronger or less strong position to deter China from, for example, trying to settle territorial disputes by force?
Thanks a lot, Secretary Clinton. Before I give you an answer, I am obliged, because I have a formal State Department role as an advisor, to say that, well, the opinions I give tonight are my own and do not necessarily represent those of the U.S. government. Okay, that's out of the way. So allies and partners are extremely important in the strategic competition to China. This has been recognized by administration after administration, and the Trump administration in the last couple of weeks seems to represent the same view, in that Secretary Rubio very early on met with the Quad allies and partners in Japan, Australia, and India. And we had the summit with Prime Minister Ishiba. This is very consistent with the U.S. strategy towards China, because you want to approach China from a position of strength. What concerns me about the alliance strategy is that it gets caught up in some of the things that we talked about in the earlier panel, and that is that most of our allies and partners around the world our closest allies and partners have trade surpluses with the United States. And if trade surpluses with the United States becomes a cause for raising tariffs against those actors, it complicates things greatly. So I look at East Asia, where our alliances are in a very good shape. The last several years, we've built them up, and there are new relationships that weren't really there before. And the one that sticks in my mind is the United States, Japan, and Korea sitting down together. We've wanted to do this for a long time, as you know. We tried and tried and tried, and we didn't get there. We finally got there, and it's very controversial in Korea. The president who did this, President Yoon, took some real risks. Now, we all know he's been in some real trouble at home, and there could be big changes in South Korea. In that environment, you want to solidify that triangular relationship. And the danger is that Korea has trade surpluses with the United States. If we raise lots of tariffs against Korea directly, that could make that relationship with Japan look more toxic, make it harder to sustain. And I'll give you another example from the region, and that is Vietnam. I traveled to 11 countries last year. I was on academic leave for the calendar year. And I got to Vietnam, and Vietnam has a very big trade surplus with the United States, and it's growing. It's growing in large part because we put tariffs on China. So Chinese firms, but also American firms, Japanese firms, and Korean firms move their production to Vietnam. Vietnam is a security partner in the maritime realm. It's not an ally, security partner in the maritime realm. If we raise tariffs on Vietnam, I worry whether we can sustain that cooperation. But equally important, South Korea invested a lot in Vietnam for final production. A lot of people don't know this probably, but Samsung, the vast majority of Samsung phones are produced in Vietnam. So if we raise tariffs on Vietnam, we're not just hurting Vietnam, a potential partner, we're hurting Japan and we're hurting South Korea in particular, and everyone's very nervous about it. So I'm worried about that trade deficit logic getting in the way of the strategic competition being executed successfully. And I take heart in the administration saying we really need to strengthen our position in that competition, and I agree with it. But certain things we could do on the economic front could undercut that unintentionally. In terms of deterrence, deterrence has two parts. I always teach my students, and some of them are out there. You have to have a credible threat of response, and you have to have a credible assurance that the response is conditional on the behavior of the actor. So in terms of credible response, we need to have a more distributed, stronger position in East Asia, more reliance on allies and partners for accesses because our fixed bases are too vulnerable to Chinese strike weapons. We also need to get our allies and partners to do more. In particular, Taiwan needs to do more for its own defense, both in terms of mobile forces that could stop an invasion, but also societal resilience for a blockade scenario if their economy is cut off. And accompanying that, and this is the important thing, accompanying that has to be an assurance to Beijing that with all these new forces and all these new capabilities in the region, the purpose of them is not to change the fundamental U.S. one China policy and to change our political relationship with Taiwan. And it's not to encourage Taiwan to take political steps in the direction of permanent independence, steps that would almost certainly lead to crisis, if not conflict. And you can't deter a conflict by causing one. So you have to mix those credible threats and assurances, and it's a delicate balance, and I'm hopeful that this administration will continue with the traditional one China policy and not divert from it, and at the same time strengthen our position in the region, to include getting more long-range weapons into the region for potential conflict, because if you have a shortage of those in peacetime, it signals weakness, and that's never a good idea.
Thank you so much, Tom. Well, we're going to end, Toria, by asking you in less than a minute to talk about the end game in Ukraine. 25 minutes to cover the world, but I think we can't leave without having you talk to that.
Well, thanks. Look, I think no matter how this ends, it's incredibly important that we not reward territorial aggression to the extent that that is possible, because it is not going to end there. President Trump does not want to go and ask the American people for more money for Ukraine. I understand that. We've been incredibly generous. But there is, as we say in our kitchen, plenty of money in the banana stand, starting with $270 billion of Putin's money that's sitting in European banks. So I don't think that this war, I don't think Putin comes to the table with anything like good faith if he doesn't think that we have both the means and the will to allow Ukraine to continue to defend herself such that it will drag out for Russia. So we have to get some leverage into this equation. Ukraine needs an end to this war. Russia needs to know that it was folly and bad for it. And Ukraine needs to come out of this as a democratic sovereign state that is further integrated into Europe. I still think that is possible, but only if we insist that we will support Ukraine until Putin comes to the table with a credible, just deal.
Well, join me in thanking our 4 panelists. You've got a snapshot of how lucky students are to be at SIPA with each of them. Thank you all.